In the summer of 415 BCE, the Greek world was in turmoil. The Peloponnesian War, a struggle for supremacy between Athens and Sparta, had raged for 2 decades. As the flames of conflict burned ever more fiercely, Athens, a naval and cultural powerhouse unmatched in the ancient world, sought to expand its dominion and secure its position at the heart of an empire. Its next target, Sicily. Sicily was a tantalizing prize. Rich in fertile lands and powerful cities, the island held strategic value that extended beyond its borders. Syracuse, the largest city on the island, was its crown jewel, a force capable of rivaling any Greek metropolis. Dominating Syracuse meant securing critical maritime routes and preventing Sparta or its allies from gaining a valuable foothold. For Athens, conquering Sicily was not merely a choice. It was a necessity dictated by its expansionist vision. It was in this context that 3 central figures emerged to lead the expedition. Alcibiades, the charismatic and controversial young general, embodied the adventurous spirit of Athens. Born into a noble family, he was as admired for his eloquence and daring as he was despised for his arrogance and lack of scruples. To him, the expedition was not just a military mission. It was an opportunity to shape Athens' destiny and etch his name into history as a visionary conqueror. On the other side stood Nícias, a veteran of past wars, renowned for his prudence and deep respect for the gods. To Nícias, the campaign was folly. He saw it as an unnecessary risk, a deadly distraction at a time when Sparta and its allies still posed an imminent threat. Yet political pressure and rivalries within the Athenian assembly forced him to take command against his will. Nícias symbolized Athens' constant dilemma. How far should ambition be pursued? Finally, there was Lâmaco, a practical and seasoned commander whose role was often overshadowed by the more influential figures. Lâmaco understood the challenges of war and knew that the campaign would test discipline and strategy, not lofty speeches. Though he lacked the political clout of Alcibiades or Nícias, he brought a pragmatic perspective and quiet courage to the table, qualities that would prove vital for the expedition. Even before setting sail, the campaign seemed shrouded in ominous signs. On the eve of departure, Athens awoke in shock. The statues of Hermes, the messengers of the gods, had been desecrated throughout the city. Their sculpted faces were mutilated, an act seen as both a dire omen and an affront to the gods. Fear and paranoia spread like wildfire, fueling rumors of treachery and hidden conspirators. Among the suspects was Alcibiades, whose scandalous private life made him an easy target for accusations of sacrilege. His political enemies seized the opportunity to demand his trial before he could embark. However, Alcibiades declared his innocence and departed with the fleet, vowing to return and defend himself once the mission was completed. Shortly after setting sail, the political tide turned against him. Alcibiades was recalled to Athens to stand trial. Fearing conviction by a biased court, he defected, seeking refuge in Sparta, Athens' greatest enemy. His betrayal marked a turning point. The expedition lost its most ardent advocate and was left in the divided hands of Nícias and Lâmaco. As the fleet advanced across the sea, uncertainty loomed. The Athenians carried with them high expectations, but also the weight of unfavorable omens and an exiled leader. The waters towards Sicily, which once seemed to promise glory, now brought doubts and fears. On the horizon lay a challenge far greater than they had anticipated. The white sails of the Athenian fleet sliced through the Mediterranean horizon like messengers of a promise. With 134 triremes carrying thousands of soldiers and sailors, the expedition was the largest ever dispatched by Athens. The sight of these vessels, reflecting the golden sunlight, symbolized the zenith of Athenian naval power. Yet, for those watching from the shores, the same spectacle could be seen as a harbinger of tragedy. Upon arriving in Sicily, the Athenians were initially well received. Smaller cities like Catana, impressed by the prestige and might of Athens, chose to ally themselves with the expedition. In Catana, the Athenians established a solid base, transforming it into a strategic point for future operations against Syracuse. Confidence grew among the commanders and troops, fueled by these early successes. For many, it seemed that the grand plan of conquest was only beginning to unfold. However, the first signs of trouble soon emerged. Sustaining a campaign so far from home proved a far greater challenge than anticipated. The ships required constant supplies, and while Sicily's resources were abundant, they were not easily accessible. Transporting grain, water, and provisions became increasingly slow and hazardous, especially as pockets of resistance began to form in nearby cities. Meanwhile, Syracuse, initially caught off guard by the expedition's arrival, began to organize. The initial fear gave way to a fierce determination to resist. Public gatherings stirred local pride, and messengers were dispatched to neighboring cities and even Italy to request reinforcements. The city's fortifications were strengthened, and the previously divided population now united under the looming threat. The transformation of Syracuse's defenses gained a decisive boost with the arrival of Gílipo, a renowned Spartan general. Informed of the invasion, Sparta saw the Athenian expedition as an opportunity to weaken Athens at its peak. Gílipo, a bold and charismatic strategist, was chosen to lead the resistance. Though he commanded only a small contingent, he understood that his mission was not solely military, it was psychological as well. Gílipo's journey to Syracuse was a testament to his audacity and diplomatic skill. Traversing hostile lands and seas, he united scattered forces and inspired confidence in cities hesitant to confront the Athenians. His arrival in Sicily was met with relief and enthusiasm. With Gílipo, Syracuse not only gained a commander, but also a renewed purpose to fight. Within the Athenian camp, divisions among the commanders became increasingly apparent. Nícias, troubled by the growing logistical challenges and reports of Syracuse's strengthening defenses, advocated for a more cautious approach. He believed the campaign should be concluded swiftly or abandoned before it became unsustainable. Lâmaco, on the other hand, argued for a more aggressive strategy, urging an immediate attack on Syracuse before its defenses were fully consolidated. Meanwhile, the absence of Alcibiades echoed through the troops and leadership. Many soldiers still clung to the promises of the young general, and his defection to Sparta fueled a sense of betrayal. For Nícias, Alcibiades' absence was a personal relief. Yet he understood that the lack of a unifying leader made decision-making even more challenging. As days passed, the difficulties mounted. Under Gílipo's leadership, Syracuse began launching small raids against Athens' allies in Catana. Each day of delay in the Athenian offensive seemed to give Syracuse more time to transform into an impregnable fortress. Simultaneously, the morale of the Athenian troops began to waver, strained by strategic uncertainty and mounting pressure to deliver results. Gílipo knew that time was on his side. Not only did he fortify Syracuse's defenses, but he also rallied support from other cities in Sicily and beyond. His message was clear. Syracuse would not only survive, but would humiliate the invaders. For the Athenians, the early days in Sicily, which had begun with promises of an easy victory, now seemed like the prelude to something far more complex and perilous. The grand fleet that once cut through the horizon with confidence now faced the weight of its own ambitions. The gates of Syracuse stood firm, but outside, the Athenians believed it was only a matter of time. Their strategy was clear: encircle the city with walls, sever its supply lines, and starve it into submission. To achieve this, Athens' engineers and soldiers worked with relentless precision, digging trenches and erecting barriers that stretched across the terrain surrounding the city. For weeks, the campaign seemed to progress without significant obstacles. The disciplined and experienced Athenian forces moved efficiently, while the Syracusans, cornered and outmatched, avoided direct confrontations. The fortifications grew day by day, and the siege began to tighten like a net around Syracuse. Yet, inside the walls, something was shifting. Under Gílipo's leadership, the Syracusan spirit not only endured, but grew stronger. To them, the walls being constructed by the Athenians were more than physical barriers. They were a direct challenge to their survival and freedom. Each stone placed by the invaders was met with one removed, a coordinated attack, or a hastily improvised fortification. Gílipo understood that facing the Athenians in open battle would be suicidal. Instead, he adopted a clever and indirect strategy. Counterwalls began to appear at key points, blocking the progress of Athenian fortifications. At night, small groups of Syracusan soldiers launched raids to disrupt the Athenians' work, destroying trenches and spreading chaos among the troops. These actions, modest at first, began to hinder Athenian progress. The pace of construction slowed, and the soldiers, once confident, now worked under constant threat. What initially seemed like mere distractions revealed Gílipo's patient and methodical plan. Every delay was a victory for Syracuse. Inside the Athenian command, tensions grew. Nícias, increasingly cautious and alarmed by the slow progress, hesitated to authorize bold actions. To him, the siege was a matter of patience. The longer Syracuse remained isolated, the sooner it would fall. Lâmaco, however, argued for a more aggressive approach, insisting that the Athenians should strike immediately before the Syracusans could fully consolidate their defenses. If we continue this way, we'll give them even more time to reinforce, Lâmaco pressed during a war council. But Nícias, weakened by illness and stress, responded coolly, "And if we attack now and fail, their victory will be absolute." As the two leaders debated, the Syracusans acted. Under Gílipo's guidance, they concentrated their efforts on constructing a counter-wall that directly intersected the Athenians' advance. For days, the two forces clashed fiercely over this construction in bloody skirmishes. From above, the scene was chaotic. Frantic workers building under a hail of arrows, while hoplites fought on unstable ground to defend or dismantle the structures. The Athenians' trenches and walls lost their momentum, and the morale of the troops faltered with each successful Syracusan disruption. Slowly, the war of attrition began to weigh on Athens. The morale, once buoyed by the grandeur of the expedition, was now eroded by fatigue and uncertainty. Every small Syracusan victory was a stark reminder that their enemy was far from defeated. However, Gílipo was not content with mere resistance. He seized the opportunity to expand support for Syracuse, sending messages to neighboring cities and distant allies. His promise was clear. Together with Syracuse, they could not only resist, but defeat and expel the invaders from Sicily. Gradually, reinforcements began to arrive from across the island and even from the Italian peninsula. For the Athenians, each passing day brought greater challenges. Exhausted troops faced not only the enemy, but also harsh weather and irregular supply deliveries. Nícias, acutely aware of the growing strain, began to question whether the expedition should continue. Lâmaco, still resolute in his determination to succeed, insisted it was possible, but even he recognized that a decisive moment was fast approaching. Beyond the walls, Gílipo observed the Athenians' slow progress. Despite the success of his defensive tactics, he knew the battle was far from over. Yet, with each passing day, he saw victory in the mere act of enduring. For the Syracusans, the siege was no longer a symbol of imminent defeat, but an opportunity to reverse their fate. In the heart of Syracuse, the flags flying high above the walls were more than symbols of resistance. They were a warning. The city would not fall without a fight. Night enveloped the Athenian camp in Catana when the arrival of a new fleet brought a glimmer of hope to the soldiers. Under the command of Demosthenes, triremes laden with men and supplies appeared on the horizon, heralding long-awaited reinforcements. The general, known for his energy and innovative tactics, brought not only fresh troops, but also a renewed sense of optimism, something the camp had long been missing. Demosthenes quickly took charge, reorganizing the army and proposing a bold plan to break the deadlock. His strategy was straightforward: launch a night attack on Syracuse, surprise its defenses, and seize key positions around the city. It was risky, but time was not on Athens' side. For Demosthenes, hesitation would doom the expedition to failure. Nícias, increasingly weakened by malaria, was reluctant to agree. He preferred to wait and strengthen the fortifications already in place, but his authority had waned. Unable to resist the pressure from Demosthenes and the other commanders, he relented. On the night of the attack, the Athenian fleet sailed silently toward the enemy positions, while infantry units took secondary routes to catch Syracuse's defenses off guard. At first, the plan seemed to unfold flawlessly. The Athenians advanced on several defensive outposts, capturing smaller fortifications and swiftly dislodging Syracusan troops. Then chaos erupted. In the darkness, the Athenian forces lost their bearings. Some units became disoriented, while others advanced without adequate support. The Syracusans, alerted by the movement, responded with remarkable speed. Under Gílipo's leadership, they launched a ferocious counter-offensive, exploiting every gap and disorganization in the enemy lines. The night assault, which began as a decisive strike, devolved into utter chaos. On the battlefield, darkness became as much an enemy as the Syracusans. Poor visibility led to confused skirmishes where Athenians often attacked their own comrades. The clash of swords and the cries of warriors filled the air, while blood-soaked, dusty ground made every step treacherous. Commanding his forces with precision, Gílipo turned the tide. He deployed strategic contingents to encircle the disoriented invaders, isolating groups and forcing them to retreat. By dawn, what remained of the Athenian army was in full retreat, leaving behind hundreds of dead and wounded. The defeat was devastating. Back at the Athenian camp, the atmosphere was heavy with despair. Soldiers who had been buoyed by Demosthenes' arrival now faced the harsh reality of a failed plan. Nícias, weakened and demoralized, attempted to maintain order, but his frail voice inspired little confidence. Meanwhile, Demosthenes, consumed by guilt and frustration, proposed abandoning the expedition altogether. "We must leave before it's too late," Demosthenes insisted during a war council. But Nícias, fearing the political repercussions in Athens, refused to order a retreat. "The city will not understand a withdrawal without something to show for it," he argued, his voice trembling with hesitation. This decision sealed the fate of the entire expedition. Inside Syracuse, the spirit of resistance reached its peak. The victory in the night battle not only boosted the troops' confidence, but also solidified Gílipo's role as an indispensable leader. Defenses were reinforced, new alliances forged, and the Syracusan forces began planning more aggressive strikes against the Athenians. The Syracusans were no longer merely resisting, they had become the hunters. Regular raids targeted Athenian supply lines, while the Syracusan navy, now better organized and growing in numbers, prepared to challenge Athenian dominance at sea. Athens' naval superiority, once a symbol of its invincibility, was now under serious threat. Conditions in the Athenian camp deteriorated rapidly. Malaria spread among the soldiers, further weakening an already exhausted force. Supplies dwindled, and the remnants of the fleet were hemmed in by land and threatened by sea. Each passing day brought a new, silent defeat as the divided leadership of Nícias and Demosthenes mirrored the expedition's loss of direction. For the Athenians, the reality was unmistakable. They were trapped, isolated, and weakened. Yet Nícias hesitated to make the decision that could save the remnants of his forces. On the other side, Gílipo waited patiently, like a predator preparing for the final strike. The night that began with promises of victory now stood as a grim reminder of the cost of arrogance. On the horizon, the walls of Syracuse gleamed under the sun, as if mocking the invaders who had believed they could conquer them so easily. Dawn over the harbor of Syracuse heralded preparations for the final battle. The Syracusans, under Gílipo's command, were ready to strike. Their ships, reinforced and adapted for close combat, blocked the harbor's exits, while troops on land ensured no escape routes remained. For the Athenians, control of the sea was their last hope. Without their fleet, they were doomed. The Athenian triremes, once the symbol of their naval supremacy, advanced into the harbor. At first, there was an attempt at order, a desperate effort to recapture the glory of past victories. But the confined space and the precise strategy of the Syracusans quickly turned the battlefield into chaos. The Syracusan ships, sturdier and more maneuverable in tight quarters, crashed violently into the Athenian vessels. Rowers screamed as wooden hulls shattered on impact. Arrows and spears filled the air from both sides, while soldiers leapt from damaged ships onto enemy decks, engaging in brutal hand-to-hand combat. At the height of the confrontation, the Athenian fleet began to falter. Leaders shouted conflicting orders. Desperate rowers tried to break through the blockade, and ships collided with one another, creating a scene of utter despair. When the last Athenian ship was sunk or captured, the harbor ran red with blood, and the deafening cries of victory from the Syracusans shattered the heavy silence. At the Athenian camp, the defeat was met with grim resignation. Nícias, weakened and visibly broken, summoned his remaining commanders for a meeting. "We cannot stay. We must retreat by land," he declared, his voice laden with despair. Demosthenes, still haunted by the failure of the night assault, agreed. But both knew the retreat would be a nightmare. Under cover of darkness, the Athenian soldiers began their silent march, abandoning what remained of their camp and equipment. The journey was slow and agonizing. Exhausted, wounded, and starving men stumbled along the trails, pursued relentlessly by the Syracusans and their allies, led by Gílipo. The Athenians were ambushed repeatedly in narrow passes and ravines. Each attack disrupted their retreat, turning it into a massacre. Day by day, more men were killed or captured. The Sicilian landscape, once seen as a land of opportunity, became a field of death. Nícias and Demosthenes tried to maintain order, but their voices were drowned out by the sounds of defeat. When they were finally captured, their executions were swift and unceremonious. For Gílipo and the Syracusans, their deaths were more than a military victory. They were a symbol. The men who dared to challenge Syracuse had fallen. The surviving Athenian soldiers were taken as prisoners to the quarries of Syracuse. Under the scorching sun and in inhumane conditions, they were forced to labor until exhaustion claimed their lives. Few survived for long. For those who escaped immediate death, their fate was slavery, a brutal reminder of their failure. When news of the defeat reached Athens, the city fell into a devastating silence. Nearly the entire fleet had been destroyed, thousands of men were dead, and confidence in democratic leadership was shattered. Sparta, bolstered by Persian financial support, now saw an opportunity to intensify its attacks. The harbor of Syracuse, once the stage for Athenian ambition, now stood as a symbolic grave for their expedition. Sicily, with all its promises of wealth and glory, had become a tomb of dreams. The tragedy was not merely military, but profoundly moral. Athens, intoxicated by its own ambition, had ignored the warnings of its limits and paid the ultimate price. In the minds of the survivors and the heart of Athens, the Sicilian expedition became an eternal reminder of what happens when hubris blinds even the most powerful. For the Athenians, the expedition to Sicily was more than a defeat. It was an open wound that would never fully heal. When the first news of Athens' defeat in Syracuse reached the city, it plunged into a heavy silence. It was hard to fathom how such a grand expedition, led by thousands of soldiers and the largest fleet ever assembled, could end in such a catastrophic failure. For many, it was not merely a military loss, but the collapse of a dream. The loss reverberated through every aspect of Athenian life. Streets that once buzzed with life became somber. Entire families mourned for brothers, fathers, and sons who would never return. Confidence in the democratic government, which had promoted and championed the expedition, was deeply shaken. Public figures who supported the campaign faced a wave of criticism, while political opponents used the tragedy to gain influence. The defeat also brought severe economic consequences. Without a significant fleet, Athens lost its ability to control maritime routes and collect tribute from its allies. Cities within the Delian League, already discontented with Athenian dominance, saw the defeat as an opportunity to rebel. Sparta, strengthened by its victory and backed by Persian funding, intensified its offensives, now facing a weakened and disorganized enemy. Within Athens, philosophers, historians, and poets began to reflect on the meaning of the tragedy. Thucydides, who would later immortalize the Peloponnesian War in his writings, described the Sicilian expedition as a quintessential example of hybris. To him, Athens' excessive ambition and arrogance blinded the city, leading it to ignore the signs of its own limitations. Thucydides' account not only condemned Athens' leadership, but also served as a universal warning. Even the most powerful empires are vulnerable to greed and recklessness. He argued that Athens, at the height of its power, succumbed to a false sense of invincibility, believing it could conquer anything without considering the consequences. Meanwhile, Syracuse celebrated its victory. The city, which many believed was on the brink of collapse, had become a symbol of resistance and determination. The leadership of Gílipo and the unity of the Syracusans were praised across the Greek world, and Athens' defeat became a cautionary tale recounted in public squares, a warning to arrogant powers. For Athens, the defeat brought a bitter lesson. The expedition, intended to secure Athens' dominance and expand its empire, became the turning point of the Peloponnesian War. From that moment on, the city would fight not for expansion, but for survival. Yet even amidst devastation, Athens did not surrender. With limited resources, it began to rebuild its fleet and attempt to restore its influence. The city that had faced the Persians and built an empire knew that as long as there was a ship and a soldier, there was hope. But the shadow of the defeat in Syracuse would linger, a constant reminder of the price of arrogance. The Sicilian expedition was not merely a military loss, it was a watershed moment in the history of the Greek world. It marked the point where Athens, at the peak of its power, saw its ambitions turn into tragedy. At the same time, it became a testament to the city's resilient spirit, which, even in the face of overwhelming adversity, never lost the will to fight. If there is one lesson the story of Syracuse teaches us, it is that no power is above the laws of prudence and balance. Sicily, with all its promises of wealth and glory, became a graveyard of ambitions, but also an eternal lesson for those who dare to challenge their own limits. If you want to understand how the Peloponnesian War reached its conclusion and how this defeat shaped the destiny of Athens and the Greek world, subscribe to the channel and follow the next chapter of this epic story.